us this morning. I am joined by Megan Van Dam, also with the Department of Planning and Development, and Megan Park as well, who is with our office also. If you'll give me 1 second, I'm going to go ahead and pull up today's presentation. All right, is everyone able to see that? Okay, awesome. Well, again, thank you all for coming. This open house will provide a summary of the preliminary recommendations that we have for the site-specific plan amendment retrospective. This process kicked off in October of last year and has evaluated a number of changes to the existing SSPA process. We have in total about an hour, and we'll provide a presentation again for about 20 minutes or so, followed by Q&A for the remainder of the time. Just so that everyone is aware, the presentation is being recorded, and we plan to summarize the feedback that we receive at all of these open houses to both the Planning Commission and the board. So before we dive into SSPA this morning, we thought it prudent to start with the main objective of our process, which is, of course, the comprehensive plan. For those who are less familiar, the comprehensive plan is used as a guide in decision-making about the built and natural environment that reflects the community's long-term land use vision for the future for Fairfax County. The plan is also a legally required document in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and every county and locality must have one. The plan, however, is not a regulatory document. It's not law like the zoning ordinance, but it does provide policy recommendations. The recommendations in the plan are used by both the Board of Supervisors, the Planning Commission, as well as the Board of Zoning Appeals, county staff, and the community as a common basis for decision-making on land use applications. It's what we call a living document, which simply means that it's consistently reviewed and updated, and any changes we make to the document are called amendments. There are various ways to amend the comprehensive plan, but for today, we're focusing on one, which is what we call the Site-Specific Plan Amendment Process, or SSPA. This process allows anyone to propose a change to the area plan volumes of the comprehensive plan, what we call nominations. The SSPA nomination period opens every 2 years on an alternating cycle between the North and South County districts, as you can see here on the map. And the current cycle began in 2017 with 4 North County supervisor districts, and that includes Sully, Providence, Hunter Mill, and Drainsville, and then shifted in 2019, just before the pandemic, to the 5 South County supervisory districts, and that includes Mount Vernon, Mason, Springfield, Braddock, and Lee. Each of the north-south rounds of the current SSPA process consists of 3 phases, which you can see identified here on the slide. The first is a nomination period during which anyone can submit a nomination for change. The second is a screening period during which district-appointed task forces and staff review the nominations in each district and ultimately provide a recommendation on which proposal should advance for formal review as plan amendments. This is followed by a public hearing and a recommendation on each nomination by the Planning Commission before ultimately concluding with Board of Supervisors action to advance nominations for further study and adopting a new comprehensive plan amendment work program. Lastly, the process enters what we call an implementation period, during which staff and the task force review the specific impacts of each proposed amendment and provide formal recommendations to the Planning Commission and the board with public hearings. So with the first full cycle of SSPA, and that includes both the North County cycle that began in 2017 and the South County cycle that began in 2019 nearing completion, staff has been evaluating the process to determine what works and what can be improved. The evaluation has identified three primary goals to improve the process. One is to reduce the overall timeline of the review process. Two is to expand the community engagement. And three, to ensure a better balance between site-specific plan amendments and other types of long-range planning studies, such as area-wide and county-wide policy amendments. The second goal speaks to the need for additional information to be submitted with each nomination to ensure that staff and those directly related to or affected by the nominations clearly understand the proposed land use changes. Community outreach on the goals was conducted in or between October and November of 2021, which included a community survey, discussions with other county agencies, task force chairs, all board and PC members, as well as discussion with the development community. So the results of the outreach, highlights of which we're going to show shortly in some upcoming slides, were presented to the Planning Commission's Land Use Process Review Committee in January of this year, and the board's Land Use Policy Committee on February 15th of this year, along with a series of draft recommendations for potential changes to the program. We also took the opportunity to reach out to several jurisdictions between Northern Virginia and Maryland to see how they handle plan amendments for site-specific proposals. We also conducted a survey in November and early December using an online tool called Public Input. In total, we received responses from about 458 participants, of which 46 were task force members, and that's about half of the total task force members that we had participate between the full cycle. 47 were nominators or development industry representatives, and about 150 were members of the public who indicated that they had participated in SSPA to date. We advertised and successfully received responses across all parts of the county, with hotspots for different levels of participation, which you can see identified in yellow on the map to the left. So the next few slides highlight some of the survey results that we received. The full results can be found on our website, and we've noted some of the main results here as they relate to community participation. So this first slide shows how people stayed engaged and hear about planning efforts. We found that district supervisor newsletters, direct contact with staff and district offices, and our comp plan listserv were the most preferred channels for communication compared to other forums such as social media. We also asked about people's preferences for engagement methods, including community meetings, open houses, task force meetings, hearing testimony, and more passive methods, such as receiving listserv updates and writing letters to decision makers, whether that's virtually or in person. The top engagement method for the nominators and the community were community meetings held for nearby residents near the sites, followed by receiving email updates. The task force option was understandably strongly supported by task force members, but the community at large was more interested in targeted community meetings or open houses. We also asked whether new potential criteria such as a site plan concept, earlier nominator engagement, a letter of intent to file a rezoning, property owner signature, submission fees would result in a clearer nomination. There was general agreement on the site plan concept, earlier engagement with mixed support for letter of intent to file for a rezoning, owner's consent, and for the fee. As previously noted, the results were presented to the PC and the board, and a working group was formed with 2 members of the board and 2 members of the PC who met with staff in February and March of this year to consider a range of options for process revisions and provided, excuse me, recommendations on potential changes to the process. The results of which have been highlighted here. And they include retaining the integrity of the current process with the nomination and screening phases and lead into the adoption of a new comprehensive plan comprehensive plan amendment work program with subsequent review of proposed plan amendments during an evaluation phase. This remains consistent with the process that we have today. However, the process would be modified to accommodate a more adaptable countywide review process with a nomination window every 2 years instead of the current 4 years. The new process would consist of a shorter 1-month nomination window and a 4-month screening phase. The timeline for review of the plan amendments, once they've been added to the work program, would vary based on the individual needs of each amendment. So as mentioned, the shorter 1-month nomination window would open every 2 years countywide. Submissions would need to meet new submission and eligibility criteria in order to be accepted for review, which we will note a little bit later in this presentation. Once accepted, they would proceed to the screening phase. A few key points regarding the screening phase. First, community engagement would remain a priority. However, recognizing the demands placed on community task forces and feedback received on this method via the survey, the task force model is reconsidered for the screening phase and are not proposed to be convened during screening anymore. Instead, targeted community meetings would be held to ensure that stakeholders, including those living and working near the subject sites, are engaged early in the process. Targeted community meetings, which were the preferred method of engagement for most stakeholders when asked, were thought to provide more appropriate forums for identifying and addressing localized issues than that of the task force. Subsequently, a planning commission workshop would take place in lieu of a public hearing for discussion of the screening the nominations. The workshop would be open to the public and provide a more deliberative forum for screening with staff and appointed officials to ensure that the high priority nominations are advanced for further review. The Planning Commission would make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors on which nominations would be added to the Comprehensive Plan Amendment Work Program for further review as proposed plan amendments. The board action on the work program would be retained following the Planning Commission workshop. Once the work program is adopted, with the additional plan amendments, the evaluation phase would begin. The timeline for individual amendment review, again, would depend on the complexity of the proposed amendment, the community engagement needs, and the availability of resources. So the amendments would not be reviewed on a uniform schedule. Community engagement for each amendment would be designed based on the circumstances of the amendment to provide options for the most appropriate means for review. So for example, singular amendments of limited scope and impact could proceed through established means, such as an existing land use committee, or feedback could be obtained from surrounding neighbors via targeted community meetings to ensure participation from those most familiar with the site. Areas receiving multiple plan amendments in close proximity to one another and or containing cumulative considerations, as well as more complex studies. And this is determined by the scale of the proposed change, the land use mix, density, intensity, the geography, and other factors. They could be considered by specifically appointed task forces. The engagement model would be coordinated with the district board member. This adaptive engagement model paired with what we hope are a more frequent nomination cycle and individualized review schedule for amendments in the evaluation phase could also help reallocate community and county resources towards other long-range planning activities outside of the SSPA process. So these proposed changes to the community engagement model, as well as the changes we will review in a minute regarding the SSP eligibility criteria and submission requirements, we think can allow for a more frequent cycle. It will provide more frequent opportunities for nominations to be submitted, assuming that other recommended changes to the nomination eligibility, to the justification criteria, and submission requirements are also modified. We have reorganized the existing criteria and clarified the intent behind each of them. The first addresses the fundamental question of what compels the need for this proposed change. The final set of proposed modifications to the process relate to the justification criteria. As part of the nomination, nominators are asked to provide a statement of justification based on a set of criteria. These criteria are used to address the fundamental question of what compels the need for the change, and are therefore used to determine what the nomination should be or how it should be advanced to the evaluation phase. Much like the proposed changes to the submission requirements, these recommended criteria are shown here on the screen, would help to determine if the proposed amendment is in line with county goals and of such high priority or strategic importance that it should warrant site-specific considerations. Through a justification, a nomination would be asked to first explain the circumstance, emerging community needs, and/or market changes that would justify the proposal. They would need to explain how the nomination aligns with the broader comprehensive plan policies and other board adopted policies. For example, that would include the Fairfax County Strategic Plan, the One Fairfax Policy, the Community Housing Strategic Plan, and others. And likewise, if a nomination is being resubmitted from a previous SSPA cycle and was not adopted in that previous cycle, they would need to explain in detail why a change in circumstances, whether that's a change in emerging trends or if they've conducted further community outreach, why this would warrant additional review at this time. For the eligibility criteria, these objectives were used to determine whether a nomination is eligible for the process. The changes would broaden the range of eligible geography by allowing the nomination of land areas subject to previous land use plan amendments after 2 years from the date of the adoption compared to the current 4-year requirement. We intend to clarify that land areas are eligible if they are currently or were previously subject to board action in an amendment with no change to the site's land use recommendation, such as a land use mix or a density. We also want to retain the current restriction on submissions for changes to county-wide policies or systems. That would be separate from this SSPA process. And we would retain the current restriction on multiple submissions by a nominator for the same property. So we want to make sure that what advances is clear and that everyone involved understands what will be reviewed if this nomination or proposal makes its way into the implementation phase. So there are several additional items that have been proposed to be required as part of the nomination to enhance the community and staff's understanding of each nomination. These additional submission requirements would be used to determine whether a nomination will be added to the work program and advanced for further review. The proposed additional submission items include an illustrative concept plan, something that would visually depict the nomination, information regarding the nominator's potential development timeline and key factors for engaging the community, We would look for consent, excuse me, of the property owners of the nominated properties, which is something that we don't have today. And we would look to include a submission fee with a waiver provision provided where needed to pay for certain outreach costs associated with the screening phase. And this generally includes notification for mailings, as an example. It would be a relatively low cost, just something to help offset those impacts. We would ask that they acknowledge with supportive data and additional analysis that supports their proposal. And we would ask that they expect to be able to provide that additional information as needed during the evaluation phase. As we get into more complex studies, additional information is needed, and we want to make sure that all nominators are aware that we may request that information as the process moves forward. That includes additional analysis like a Chapter 870 for transportation review, environmental mapping, for example, et cetera. Quickly, and I'm going to wrap up here because I know we're almost out of time, or I'm definitely over my time. The recommendations for the changes to the SSPA process were developed with significant input from planning stakeholders and provide an avenue for the county to better address long-range planning by ensuring greater flexibility, one, and more efficient use of time in the SSPA process. The changes would modify rather than replace the current process, retaining some of the beneficial elements that have been added over time to organize and prioritize our long-range planning efforts. The changes would not only retain the ability of the public to participate at each stage, but would adapt and gear community engagement towards unique circumstances and the needs presented by the potential amendments, and for those who live and work near the sites. Finally, the changes to the cycle frequency, the eligibility, and the enhancement to the submission requirements and justification criteria, paired with the revised engagement model, can ensure that high priority nominations that are most in alignment with county goals can advance for further review. Finally, the changes would be paired with periodic discussions and updates with the Planning Commission and Board to ensure that the work program is oriented towards broader planning priorities such as countywide policy and area studies. So the recommendations on the SSPA retrospective will be presented to the Planning Commission's Land Use Process Review Committee on May 19th, that's next week, following which the Board's Land Use Policy Committee will consider the changes and feedback received by the community, by the Planning Commission and staff at the June 14th meeting, and that's of this year, of course. Board action is anticipated on June 28th, and should the board adopt the recommendations, we anticipate that the countywide nomination period would commence in September of this year. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I will open it up to you all if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to add. Feel free to also, if it's easier, to type your question or comment in the chat, and Meg and I will respond accordingly. Thank you. Yes, Fran.
Oh, hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, ma'am.
My question has to do with nominations by the public. My understanding is that now you're recommending that if I wanted to do a nomination, I would have to get the property owner to consent to that nomination. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. And that was something that we heard from a lot of different folks. That we had a few nominations, I believe, in this most recent cycle, where the individual property owners were maybe not as supportive of the proposal, at the very least had not heard about the proposal. And I know particularly in the Mason district, there had been some concern about how or whether or not the task force felt comfortable considering ideas for properties where the property owner themselves were not aware. So that is a requirement. We will ask that any nomination consult with the property owner and have to some degree buy-in from that property owner before proceeding.
So we've had a
And
process.
I would echo. Hi, Fran. This
Hi.
is Megan. It's great to see you. Thank you for
Good.
joining us. I would echo that also. Mike mentioned the Mason District Task Force. That was also the case for at least two, if you include one on one that involved mobile homes along Richmond Highway. So the Mount Vernon Task Force also they had this issue arise within their work as well.
Well, we've had this process for a number of years, and I guess it depends on what district you're in, how it worked out. In Providence, we've had nominations where the property owner, as a courtesy, was told that this was coming, but he didn't have to buy in. The process brought everybody to the table to come up with a plan that was eventually approved and submitted as part of the comprehensive plan. So I think in many ways, this is eliminating the general public from commenting on properties around them. So I'm a little disappointed to hear that we can't have an open discussion as part of this process. Just a comment.
And I would say there are 2 points. I mean, I think it might be, we hear you, Fran. I know the situations that you're talking about, and that historically that has been part of the APR process, and it was true for this round of SSPA. We think it's, and certainly out of the community survey, it's a priority to really bring the property owners in at the very beginning. And that's what we're trying to do. The involvement doesn't have to mean that they agree with it, but they have to be aware of it and that they're consenting that a nomination can be submitted. So I think that's what, when Mike was saying some amount of buy-in, that the property owners at least acknowledge that they are willing to have the conversation with the community. And we think that came out of the survey, that it was a priority for it to happen at the beginning of the process. So I don't know that I would say that, we're not looking to cut out those types of nominations. That these recommendations are an attempt to just to do, as I was saying, to bring the property owners in earlier. And I think that there is part of the process, and I know Mike sort of touched on this, but part of the process changes are in an effort to open up staff resources so that we can have more room for community planning efforts. And I think that includes area planning efforts where we might have the need to look at certain areas as a whole and engage the community and the neighbors and the property owners in that process. And that is, as those types of studies happen, because of the larger scale, you can't always get the sign off on the property owners at the beginning. But we do think that there's still room for that, and we'd like to see more of that actually, so that we can not focus so much on individual sites and look more towards and spending our time on those larger community planning efforts, which we think oftentimes make a larger impact, because you can address larger geographies, larger issues, countywide, thousands of acres or so at a time, versus doing site-by-site analysis.
Well, I could just tell you from my experience, the nominations that were submitted by individual citizens would not have gotten support from the property owner.
Mhm.
You know, there was a courtesy thing where the property owner was notified. And in both cases that I can think of right now, the property owner submitted his own nomination.
Mhm.
So, you know, it gave everybody an opportunity to sit and, you know, look at a plan and decide what made the most sense.
Mhm.
So I'm just concerned if you have to have an absolute buy-in, um, I think the general public loses in the long term.
Yeah. And I'd add that, you know, if and when the property and a property owner submits, you know, part of the goal of this is to have that still have that conversation with the community. Just echoing what Mike said, you know, we are looking to you know, make a process that really does have that community engagement and has it in a more equitable way. You know, and trying to sort of broaden the tools that we have available, because we have had a lot of success in other plan amendments with doing community engagement workshops, public meetings.
Sure. Yeah. I don't want to take up all your time here, but I do have another question that's about transportation. In the last go round, the transportation issue is what made the process go on forever. Are you doing anything to control that a little better?
I don't know I don't know to what degree we can sort of control the level of analysis that's needed. What I will say is that we are hopefully setting a better expectation in terms of timing and identifying the needs and just the overall level of complexity of each amendment in advance. So what we had today was a sort of uniform process across all of the SSPA amendments, where we ideally tried to move them through the process in a coordinated fashion, recognizing now that there may be individual needs with each amendment. I think we would include and prepare more time in advance for reviewing nominations that may need that additional analysis. And that goes for transportation or stormwater or any additional review that we may have.
The issue that we had last time around was when the transportation numbers didn't work out, they changed what was proposed for the property and did another set of analysis, which added another, 2 months to the process. I think we could have been there for another year with the way it was going. So anything you can do, I think the analysis is important, but I think it has to be realistic. And maybe you have a situation where you have one idea and it doesn't work, so you do something else, but you don't do it 4 times, because that's outrageous.
Yeah,
For,
and I understand. I didn't mean to cut you off, Ms. Fran.
no, that's okay.
And that's, I think we're trying to add more clarity into the process. And Mrs. Payton, I see you too. I'll come to you. To ensure that the nominations as submitted, that we are all, both staff, the community, the appointed officials, are clear about what's going to be reviewed in advance. And that's why you see some of the changes to both the eligibility criteria, including the need for better justification, so that we, to the degree that we can, we avoid having avoid the process of trying to consider multiple land uses or significant changes throughout the process. And hopefully that helps with managing the time a little bit better.
It should. Thank you very much, both of you, Megan and Mike.
Certainly. Thank you. And Mrs. Payton, I'm sorry.
Yeah, hi. So I read the white paper and just saw the presentation. I have 3 comments. One is that it seems that this new process makes it a little harder for advocates of certain land use aspects to participate in the process. I'm talking about people like who advocate for affordable housing or certain kinds of transit-oriented development or active transportation. There's some very active groups in Fairfax County that do kind of keep an eye on different developments that are going on and like to chime in and point out where there's an issue or where there's something good happening. And with the current process I've been involved with for, I think, 2 years, we got a list of all the issues in our area. And I was able to alert both the larger advocacy groups to certain sites and the local people to certain sites, people who had not been notified but were greatly affected by the site so that they could participate. So that's kind of a watchdog function, like a nonprofit or activist watchdog function. And I think that's really important that the county encourage that, because it is a major part of change, of getting change. And I don't see how it's easy to monitor, for groups to monitor all of the submissions that are going on. The other issue is that it seems to be again excluding certain residents in an area. When on page 8 you say that it would involve notification of neighboring properties, and we're also pushing against that idea and calling on the Planning Commission to set up a new policy where they would notify not only property owners but also mobile homeowners and tenants that are adjacent to an area of land use change, especially in the comp plan and the rezoning stages. And we find that about 30% of Fairfax residents are renters, and that they actually may be more amenable to certain kind of changes than the property owners, and excluding them from participating in land use decisions seems not right anymore with our One Fairfax policy and just general democracy. So you shouldn't have to own property to vote or to make comments on land use decisions in the county. That's my personal philosophy. And so I'd encourage you now to notify neighboring residents, not neighboring properties. I know that's the state law, but we can go beyond the state law. And the third thing is that the notifications are, when they are put out, that you really need to have some level of education and planning language to even read them, even to figure out what it is that's happening. And it would be really great if you guys could figure out a way. I know you have legal requirements and all that, but if there was some way to use some plain language in describing what the action or the proposal is, I think that would help both the advocates and the residents. Advocates have worked on educating ourselves on the language, but a lot of residents don't do that, and it would be helpful to them, especially to have a plain language translation for each of the submissions.
Yes, ma'am. I don't think I could agree with you more. I'll start with your first point. We are actively, as part of, we typically actively look to expand our outreach, even more so now as part of the One Fairfax policy. The agency is reviewing a lot of our processes to think about how we reach folks who aren't typically involved in our process. That includes renters, that includes folks who aren't just adjacent to the impacted site, but who may have a stake in the site. And that speaks to, I think, some of the advocacy groups that you're mentioning. What we hope this process will do is break apart the sort of task force focused model for funneling information into the process. And these targeted community meetings, we hope, would expand our ability to reach groups that we typically aren't able to reach only using the task force model. That gives us more flexibility in terms of the timing in which we can engage with folks. the tools that we use to engage with folks. And we're not just thinking about perhaps a single community meeting. It could be, maybe one or two that best fits the needs of the community based on the proposals that have come forward. So ideally, the flexibility that we're building into, at least for the screening phase, as well as the implementation phase, we hope would allow for more groups to feel like they're at the table, and bring more groups, allow groups to directly speak to their concerns and their needs. Now, we will still have to think about exactly what that looks like, in terms of how the community meeting is facilitated, what we do with the information that we received, and the feedback loop that we create with you all. But we think, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that going beyond the task force model can help with that in certain cases.
Good, but I think it needs more thought. I mean, right now I don't see it. I don't see any way. I mean, I had to fight to get on the task force, and I got on it so I could watch what was going on. And I don't see a way that I can work with you in the new model to find out what things are coming up. So I'll be very happy to talk with you more about that online and figure out something that we can relate to, because I think it's very important to have not only local, but also, for example, with the Huntington Metro SSPA, I think it is important to have the healthy Fairfax communities groups and the smart growth people, and people who really know a lot about transit-oriented development to come and be part of that conversation.
Absolutely. Definitely want to take you up on that offer to talk a little bit more about your thoughts. It sounds like there's some more personalization. It sounds like when you're operating from a task force position, versus maybe if you're representing a group. Is that sort of what you're saying? Because you said that you were.
Yeah, and I would, if I could interject too, Mike. Mary, I know we've talked about this for years, and I guess I would say progress is slow, but I think we are moving forward, as Mike has said, and I think this question that you raised came up at one of the open houses yesterday as well, and I think and certainly we're aware of it, the county's aware of it, and there's actually a discussion happening at the kind of the senior leadership level about how information about land use cases, not just for plan amendments, how that information can be consolidated and just made available by district or by area, so that anyone could for example sign up for a listserv and get have access to a weekly email, and of course this is an example, but a weekly email of things that are happening within that area. So I mean I think what you're raising is an important one, and the decision about how that happens is really it's not limited to comprehensive planning work, although comprehensive planning work is a big part of that, and so I think the decision is really it's a conversation that's happening not just for this process, but for how the county notifies and lets advocates, other stakeholders know about upcoming projects, or milestones within projects like hearings or community meetings or something like that. So it's one that the community is addressing, but I agree with Mike. I mean, if we'd like to, we can certainly talk about this offline. I know we've had some conversations about it in the past as well. So perhaps we can continue that conversation and get some insight as far as the best opportunities to or the best channels for communication for representatives of different advocacy groups like yourself.
I think that would be good, because right now I'm on a listserv and I get when something's coming up to the Planning Commission, but then it's sometimes a little late. You're into a formal hearing process, whereas sometimes it's better to know a little bit earlier. about something that you can have more impact.
Yep. Yeah, and I think one of the things that we, and Megan Park is on here, she's involved in the notifications within our agency, and it's great to have her listen to the conversation, because one of the things that I would say that what we're trying to do with these changes is really make sure, because we've always had historically, APR, SSPA, and then we've had these board authorizations, right? So they're kind of, and those are outside of the cycle. Those are harder. They've been historically sort of harder to find out information about. And what we're trying to do with some of these changes is really sort of blend them together so that we can really try to look at a uniform way of pushing out information, with the listserv, and uniform standards for, are we putting out public hearing notifications? Are we putting out staff report publications? Would we also want to use the listserv for upcoming community meetings, which we don't now? So we can, I think by these changes, we can, we'll have space to sort of, to think about and to talk about how, and make decisions about how we can use our existing channels for better communication to everyone. Because I think that listserv is, it does have, hundreds of people on it, and it's a great system. We do have, we are continually wrestling with how much information do we put out, since it's a county-wide listserv, before we might get people considering it spam. And if you're on the listserv and you're looking at Richmond Highway, do you want to get notifications about Reston? And I mean, maybe that's important. Maybe you do want to see what's happening in the rest of the county. So when we talk with you, Mary, it might be good to get your insight on that aspect of it as well.
Thank you for those comments. Did anyone else have any additional questions? Fran, I see that your hand is still up. I didn't know if you had another question.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I don't know how to put my hand down.
That's okay.
I think I did that.
Perfect.
I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this. I think it's important that we try to educate as many people as we can, and that people understand the process, so it makes it easier for them to participate. So thank you.
Thank you. Again, we're always available. Again, we open the open houses to invite general discussion so that others could hear anyone's thoughts. But if any of you have specific questions about the process moving forward, please feel free to reach out to myself or Graham or Megan. And Megan, you had something?
I do. It looks like we have one more hand up. Debbie?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Do we have time for one more,
Yes,
Mike?
ma'am. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. You can hear me, okay. My question is, maybe I had to step off for a little while, so forgive me if I'm repeating something in a question. With the shortened cycle to 2 years, is there a way, or is there any consideration to limiting the out-of-turn plan amendments by district supervisors?
That's actually a part of the reason for the change. What we often are faced with is the out-of-turn amendments are introduced because there isn't a process with a time frame that sort of works with the developer's interest. And so we're hoping that by opening the window for a more frequent process, that it limits the number of out-of-turn amendments.
Okay.
That is a goal.
Yeah, okay, very good. I think that, with the shorter cycle, I think community members can be overwhelmed if, you're going on 2 years now, and then you have other board authorizations in the meantime. That just can be a burden to the community. Yeah. And what was the other one I was going to ask you? Is something's slipping my mind. Task force. With limiting, I think, also limiting the number. Is there consideration to limiting the number of nominations in the 2-year cycle?
So there's not necessarily a limit to the number of nominations. However, we can only even as staff, right, we can only work on so much at a given time. And so the goal is to prioritize the amendments as they make it onto the work program. So in a similar fashion, we don't want the community to be overwhelmed. We want folks to be able to follow along with whatever's happening in their area. But that goes for staff as well. So the number of nominations that we will consider isn't limited, but we will have to think carefully about which amendments that are ultimately accepted, how they're prioritized, and which move first and in what order, et cetera.
And
very good.
if you don't mind, can I add as well the to that point about the 2-year cycle? You know, the 2-year cycle is really, the nomination window will be every 2 years,
Right.
but the plan amendments are not guaranteed to make it through the process in those 2 years. They may make it through the process shorter, if it's something pretty straightforward, and as Fran mentioned, doesn't need a lot of transportation analysis. But it might take a little bit longer if in instances of more sort of complex nominations, larger changes, bigger geographies, things like that. So, so that's if we do have plan amendments that may run over that 2-year mark, that will affect how many new plan amendments we can take on and add to our work program in the next round. So I just wanted to make that point that every 2 years is not a length of time for the entire process to get through, and that all the plan amendments will be done in 2 years. It's really just how frequently that nomination window may be opened.
Yeah, that was clear. No, I understood
great.
that. Yes.
Okay.
And then I also wanted to know I think there was a workforce that was comprised of 2 members of the Board of Supervisors and the Planning Commission. Who were those members, and are there meetings online also?
The names off the top of my head.
Yep, it was supervisors Rodney Lusk from the Lee District and Kathy Smith from Sully, and then commissioners John Elfelder, who's the chair of the Land Use Planning Commission's Land Use Policy Committee, and Tim Sargent, who's an at-large member of the Planning Commission. Those meetings are not the meeting minutes. We did not record them, or so I should say the video. We didn't record them. I do think we have notes available if somebody wants to go through them. But if you're interested in finding out more about the working group meetings, I can put my email in the chat, and you please follow up with me. I realize, are you now a bit? Can you see the chat? Is your internet back?
Yes, it is. Thank goodness.
Okay, great. So let me put if you'd like to talk more about that, let me put my email in the chat, and we can also put the link to the white paper that Mike referenced as well in the chat on the SSPA webpage.
Very good. I see. I'm at meeting chat. Okay, good.
Yeah, so that should be in the chat, and then I'll put the link to
You got it.
page
Okay.
in the where you can find meeting recordings for these meetings.
Okay. Very good. And then one last thing, unless somebody wants to go who has a hand up, about task force composition. The person who spoke before me had a hard time getting onto a task force. What is the criteria for getting onto the task force? It shouldn't be just limited to those who are immediately adjacent, because it should be a broader group that's involved in these task forces. Everybody, if it involves something, dense, and it's going to affect a lot more people than those immediately adjacent. So, what is the criteria for putting together a task force?
Understandable. At present, we work closely with the supervisor district offices, and they provide us with the names of representatives across their district to be included on the task force. Typically, it's a few more than can actually attend. We reach out to folks to see who may be available for a given period of time. based on the list of names that they give us. That's generally what we've relied on to this point.
Okay, so organized through the supervisor's office. Okay, all right,
Yes,
that's it for me.
We have a few more minutes. We're a little over, but I talked way too long in the presentation, so we'll give it a couple more minutes. If any others have any questions or thoughts, feel free. Okay, all right. I'm gonna take the silence as a no. Again, we'll reiterate. I know Megan has left some information in the chat for you all. This process is continuing, and hopefully we will have things wrapped up and a new process in place by the summer. If you'd like more information, feel free to contact us. Go to our website, and we thank each and every one of you for your attendance.
Yep, and I would just, sorry to have the last word here, Mike, but for Debbie's question about the availability of planning commission discussions, the meeting next week on the 19th that Mike mentioned on that timeline, that is a public meeting. You can watch it on, I believe you can watch it on channel 16, and there's call-in information about that, and that is. Information about that's posted to the website, I believe, and if not, we can get it up there. So you can listen to some of the Planning Commission discussion about it. I know that there has been a lot of discussion, but we've already heard from them about notifications and things like that and community engagement. So feel free to join us on that. And then also the board's discussion on, I believe it's the I'm losing my dates, the 14th, right? The Land Use Policy Committee in the afternoon of the 14th. That's also available and publicly that you can attend or stream it, as well as any decisions that could maybe potentially made on the 28th.
Well, with that, we hope you all have a great day. I think it's starting to rain, or it's drizzling here, so stay safe, and we'll talk with you all soon.
Thank you again.
All right, thank you.